Welcoming you to a life of awareness, the Presence Project is excited for you to join us for today's podcast with your host, Paul Kerzner.
Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Are You Being Present? My name is Paul Kerzner. I want to welcome you to the present moment. I want to welcome you to the here and now. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly, sincerely, and deeply for joining me in this amazing present moment. The title and topic of today's podcast is Gaining Presence Astrologically. I've invited Tara Divina to join us. She's from Visionary Readings Vedic Astrology, and she is an amazing Vedic astrologer. I've had the pleasure of having her read my chart, and I felt like it was a good opportunity to bring this topic to the forefront. So here is my interview with Tara Divina. The first time I had my chart read was probably a good 10 years ago, and it's interesting because I originally thought that my birth time was 4:20 a.m. And I had no idea that, a few minutes can shift so much. So for at least 3 or 4 of my readings, I had the wrong time. And it's interesting, though, because some of the things that they were telling me were relevant to my life, but some of the other things were completely off. So I had this very skewed experience of astrology because it was like 50-50. It wasn't until I ordered a copy of my birth certificate that I found out that I was actually born at 3:30 a.m. And a part of me thinks it's actually 3:33. But once I got that information dialed in, that's when my readings became a lot more accurate. And I started getting some really relevant and helpful and specific information, almost eerie, about like what my life has been like, some of the challenges that I've experienced, and maybe some of the challenges that I'm going to experience. And I found that to be very powerful because I look at that kind of information as helpful. I understand that at the end of the day, we all have free will and that we do have a path, but that path can be altered at times. And so I don't ultimately believe that we have one specific destiny, more so that there are multiple threads or strands in the multiverse that we live in of possibilities. And over the past 10 years, I've worked with a few different astrologers with different backgrounds, and I had no idea that there were different styles of astrology. And I found it interesting to delve into the different types and get the different kinds of information and the way it's presented differently. My experience has been profound, to say the very least. And I do believe that astrology has a tremendous impact on our present moment. It also has the ability to take us out of the present moment because it does relate to and reflect towards our past and also towards a potential future. And, that always has the capability of pulling us out of the moment. But at the same time, it gives us a better idea of who we are and where we are. And so to have an amazing astrologer on the podcast, it seems very fitting. And I think that I would definitely like to hear a bit more about you, Tara, and so that my audience can understand who you are, and maybe you can give us some information about what's going on right now in the universe.
Great. That sounds good. What would be, where should I begin? There's so many different threads I could pick up on, especially given what you just shared.
I mean, if you want to pick up on that, if you want to talk a little bit about yourself, that would be helpful.
Great. Well, I just, as you were speaking about free will, my ears perked up because, of course, this is a hot topic in the world of astrology, and especially so in Vedic astrology. One of the interesting realizations that one has in studying Vedic astrology is just around the amount of free will that we have as humans. And of course, in one sense, we have free will in every instant to choose our path, right? Like we can allegedly make any choice that we want. And on the other hand, it does seem like our lives are guided by an invisible hand, some sort of unseen force that creates things that are unexpected and surprising or seem fated. And in fact, one of the purposes of Vedic astrology is to expose the areas where we do have a lot of free will, or any free will, and also reveal those areas where we don't have much. And, I think I went into the study of astrology believing we had a lot more free will than I do now. Now I feel like it's been an interesting discovery of just how much the planet's energy, the energy of the planet, does in fact influence us. And it's not even so much that the planet itself is influencing us, but more that what the planet represents, which is our karma, the fruits of our past actions from this lifetime and more likely previous lifetimes, are coming, are guiding our life. That like there's events and there's feelings and there's all sorts of things that are truly beyond our control. And I used to be someone who really felt like, well, anything's possible in any moment. But I think that the grace of astrology is being able to identify where we actually should and can surrender to what's happening to us versus trying to intervene or create a different outcome for ourselves. And I know for myself personally in my life, it's been extraordinarily helpful to be able to see like, okay, this particular area of my life is troubled and there's nothing I can do to change the fact that it's troubled, though I can definitely make choices to minimize the trouble or to increase my capacity to bear it. And so, for example, if I am having a few years where it looks like I'm going to be moving around a lot, this example is close to home because I've been moving around a lot for the last few years. I can surrender to that and just understand, like, when suddenly things happen, I have to move, beyond all expectation or understanding of why it's going on. It's like, oh, okay, well, that was supposed to happen. There really wasn't anything I could have done about that. But because I'm expecting it, because I'm surrendered to it, it's not as big of a deal and there's not as much suffering. So I really love that it's one of my favorite things about astrology, about Vedic astrology in particular, is that it gives us the freedom to know where we're not free, and ironically, paradoxically, give us a better experience.
So, we do in some way have a choice. I mean, we can create more self-inflicted suffering. That's always an option for some people, or we can submit to the will of the universe or karma or whatever.
In theory, that's true. But for some people, they're going through a phase, where perhaps their emotional well-being has been deeply influenced, or maybe one might even use the word hijacked by a particular energy. And so what I've seen over the years is that even though someone might have the intelligence, like the intellectual understanding that they need to surrender, or the understanding that simply by being non-attached or by not reacting, they'll have a much better outcome, they find themselves unable to change their behavior or their response in that moment. So it's been very interesting to observe. In fact, really the power that we have is to accept what's happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. And there's definitely, I've spoken at length about acceptance of the present moment in a way so that regardless of what's happening, we accept it for what it is, to reduce suffering, to reduce the conflict, to, in some way, act as if we've asked for it, because that way there's an opportunity for growth and learning instead of creating a problem for yourself, which is at the root of that is resistance.
Yeah. That's a powerful distinction, and one that I've personally found great freedom in terms of acting as though we've asked for a particular thing. And, it's interesting, it's not something that I can always access. And what I've noticed is not everyone can always access that. And sometimes we're destined to be resistant and suffering. And that's just it. And sometimes we go through phases and periods where that's just what's on tap.
But do you feel
might have, yeah?
Sorry, go on.
As I say, we might have the wherewithal to get help or get support or take in this wisdom or apply the wisdom we already have, or we may not. That just kind of depends on how deep the karmic grooves are in that moment.
But do you feel like if someone comes to you or to any astrologer and gets a reading and they are given information about a future event that is seen in their chart, that in some way that creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where they're going to create that situation subconsciously?
It can be, except one argument against that is retrodiction. So, for example, not only can we predict by looking at a chart and say, okay, maybe you'll move in June or something like this, right? We can also retrodict and look at a chart and go, 5 years ago in June, you moved. And that retrodiction, right? We can say that didn't happen because we mentioned it. It's not like an event happened 5 years in the past because I mentioned it today. And so it's the same thing with prediction. We could say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, but that can't be true if retrodiction works.
Yes, but I think that's one of the concerns that some people have when it comes to astrology is that having someone tell you what your future is going to be will alter someone's path.
Yeah.
Because of a belief system that it is something that's definitely going to happen.
Absolutely. And that's why, for example, in my readings, I don't tell people what's going to happen in their future unless it's extremely constructive. So for example, let's say I have someone who's super worried about money. They're stressing about it all the time, every day. And I look in their chart and I see that there's probably going to be a lot of money in their near future. I may let them know that they don't need to worry. That would be an example of a constructive use of prediction. Or if I see that someone is likely to become very ill in the future, I might advise them to conserve their resources, to take extra good care of their bodies. I will never say you're going to become extremely ill 10 years from now, or 5 years from now or tomorrow, because that's not really constructive. That would just create worry in their mind. And so it really is, just because the information's there doesn't mean you want to use it without discernment.
This is actually a helpful point, I think, for people who have no experience with astrology, or even a basic inquiry is like, what kind of information can a person learn from having their chart read? Is it that we can learn the minutia of our life? And when I say minutia, just the nuts and bolts of it, or is it just all big picture stuff?
Well, it depends what system you're working with, first of all. So I'm a Vedic astrologer. I don't know all that much about Western astrology, so I'm going to speak from the Vedic perspective. But Vedic astrology can be very precise and specific. So in Vedic, you actually can narrow down events and situations to the week or the month, or some of the more notorious astrologers from the past, the superstars, could narrow it down to the minute. And there's very few beings on the planet that can do that at this point. But it can become very specific. The legendary astrologers of history could say, a blue boat will come bearing news of your sister at 2:15 p.m. from the eastern direction. Those would be the kinds of things that might come up. Nowadays, what's more likely and more accessible is, observations about your character and your nature and all of that general stuff around what is your purpose, what is your general relating style, what is your overall health like, what is your living situation like, those types of things. And then more specific predictive things like, okay, well, you're likely to meet someone that you fall in love with next year, or I see a move coming up in 6 months, or money might be tight in this particular window. So be careful, or don't do any extreme sports during this particular window because you might be accident prone, or things like that. So it can get quite specific, though. Again, only as specific as it'll be useful.
And I guess that that's for you to decide what's useful as the person reading the chart.
Right. Exactly. It's kind of a dance between me and the person I'm reading for. So if the person I'm reading for is specifically asking for information, then I'm going to give them that information within reason. If they're not specifically asking for information, but I think it's important for them to know, then I'll use my judgment. Absolutely use my judgment. Again, I only want to share what's going to be constructive and useful, and ultimately leave people with more peace and more power and more clarity.
So, when you're working with your clients, and you're trying to guide them and give them this information, how do you do so without making them completely future focused? Because I can see that being an issue, and it pulling people out of their present moment and just looking for future outcomes. And that could be an issue by itself.
Well, generally, if there's a question, we're also looking at the root of the question. So each question has a reason for existing, or a source. If someone asks me a question, they're like, I'm super anxious about my job, and I am up all night spinning about it, and tell me what's going to happen, right? There's two things happening here. One is there's a question about the future of this person's job. Two is this person has extremely high anxiety. So I might look at their chart and say, well, what are you eating? And they're like, okay, for breakfast I had coffee and a green juice, and then I skipped lunch, and for dinner I had a sandwich and 12 cookies. It's like, okay, well, let's look at your lifestyle and see what the source of this anxiety is. Because oftentimes what happens is people ask a question about one area of their life, like their career, and they think it's totally unrelated to other areas of their life, like their health or their relationships. And that's never the case. They're completely interconnected. And so usually, if there's a question about the future, I take a step back and look and see how that question connects in with any other challenges or strengths in that person's chart, and then give them a big picture answer in addition to whatever specific question they may have asked.
So is it a matter of you looking at the question itself and interpreting it and putting together all those strands, or is it literally in the chart? Like if someone has a health issue,
So that's a great question. It's a combination of what's in the chart. So I might look at their chart and notice, oh, this is a person who's unlikely to have much self-control when it comes to eating, or they're likely to eat foods that would give them a lot of anxiety, or vata, or air movement. And then maybe they'll ask a question about their career, and I might hear anxiety in their voice. Well, that might be a time where I would link those two things together. It's a combination of what's in the chart, and then also, which is like the Sanskrit word for a certain type of intelligence that is coming through me, from this body of knowledge, through me as a channel as well. So there's a certain level of kind of having a relationship with this body of wisdom, so that it can flow through me unfettered. So a good reading is really very much about me getting out of the way so that those connections can be made.
So you act as a channel for source information or source knowledge.
Exactly. There's like a tremendous amount of study and knowledge that I need to put in first. And then once that's there, it's like this energy that I'm channeling helps to put the information together in a constructive, cohesive manner.
So it's not as simple as just looking at someone's chart and just, giving them whatever information comes to mind.
No.
At least for
There's
your
definitely,
at least for your process.
well, it's also the way, it's also a known element of Vedic astrology. So if you have a Vedic astrologer who's not in touch with this, they're probably not very good. They probably don't know what they're doing. So it's not even a personal thing like, oh, I do this thing. It's just the way it works and the way that it's generally taught. It's something good to look out for. If you can tell, because when somebody's giving you magical reflections that about yourself that are deeper than anything you've heard, that touch parts of you that have never been touched. You feel seen in ways you've never been seen. You can sense that there's an element of something bigger than just a person staring at a bunch of symbols and letters and numbers on a page or a screen.
How did you get involved in Vedic astrology?
It was really wild. I was never interested in astrology of any kind, or really esoterica at all. And I met this gentleman, and we were just having a casual meeting. He was a friend of a friend. I asked him what he did for a living, and he said he was a Vedic astrologer. And immediately, my ears perked up in a very unforeseen way. I found myself very interested, and I didn't know why. And maybe a year later, I had an opportunity to have a reading with him. And so I went in. It was my first astrology reading. And he absolutely blew my mind. He told me things that no one had ever reflected to me before, things that I knew to be true deep down, but had never been articulated in a way that I could really piece them together. And I was floored, absolutely floored. And not only that, but I had this sudden voracious appetite to learn Vedic astrology. And this was momentous for me because, I'd never ever felt like, oh gosh, I have to learn everything about anything before. This was my first experience of feeling like absolutely driven to do something. And so I began devouring all the information I could find. And then luckily for me, this gentleman who gave me the reading introduced me to his teacher. And I was blessed to be able to work with a really solid lineage of Vedic astrologers and learn from who I consider to be among the very best. And that's how I got into it, was just this deep and surprising knowing that pulled me towards this body of work and said yes.
I always find that, when it comes to seeking advice or guidance, it's best to find people that are not only truly passionate about what they do, but have been touched by their medicine, basically. And
Yes.
Those are the people that we need to seek out, because those are the people that are going to be most connected. They have the most skin in the game. They can relate personally to the experience, and that makes them a better guide, and someone that you can relate to, because they can relate to you. So it sounds like, that's been your experience. And, in many ways, like, it's just kind of paying it forward. You want other people to have the kind of experience that you had.
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly. I like to call it burning in the fire of your own medicine. And I fully agree with you. It's something where, like, if we're a provider of a particular medicine, in this case, astrology being the medicine, not only do we have to have had an experience of it, but it has to be an ongoing experience. We have to be living that medicine, living that truth. Otherwise, we're not going to be a very good carrier of it. And so what I found personally is that whatever medicine I'm dishing out likes to give me a wallop periodically and really test me, see how far I'm willing to go in terms of my faith and my willingness to apply it to my own life. I think that's a great distinction.
Yeah. No, I mean, I fully relate personally and professionally. So, I know tonight is a full moon and there's a few things going on right now in the universe. And I think it would be interesting to hear a little bit about, like what kind of effect that has on the chart, and what's your perception and perspectives on this present moment?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot going on right now astrologically. A lot of change, a lot of intensity. Of course, people like to tell me that everyone always says that. Anytime they ask an astrologer what's going on, they're always like, everything's super intense and crazy right now, and that no one ever just says, it's smooth sailing from here on out. But such is life. Life is crazy and intense, and so the astrology is simply a reflection of that. What's happening right now, full moons are super intense. Anytime you have a full moon, there's the maximum amount of light in the night sky. The moon is not only out for the longest period of time because it rises as the sun sets, but it's full, so it's illuminating everything in its wake. So all the plants and the animals and the people, they have the maximum amount of juice in their system. And that's why full moons have gotten such a wild reputation. If you think of all the crazy thing, the word lunatic, the werewolves, everything that's associated with the craziness of a full moon, that's why it's like when we are fully imbued with this energy, it can be overwhelming. So full moons are, they're beautiful, they're auspicious. We have the maximum amount of light. The moon represents our instinctive mind, our tastes, our emotional body. And so when the moon is full, that's good. It means that we're nourished, but it can also be a lot to handle. And so what's special about this full moon today on February 10th, 2017, is that we have also a lunar eclipse. And lunar eclipses always coincide with full moons. The moon has to be full in order for it to happen. And eclipses are ominous events. According to Vedic astrology, it's like an omen of interrupted light, essentially. So if you can see an eclipse, if you were to look outside and actually be able to observe an eclipse, a lunar eclipse, you see the moon, a shadow becomes cast over the moon in part or in full. And so there's a way that, the plants and the animals and the people, you're all used to the moon has a certain rhythm, right? So the moon will shine a certain amount of light, without fail every single night. It's predictable. And so the eclipse is a predictable but ominous interruption into the light of the moon. And so it signals a time where the veils are thin and there's a lot of shadow and illusion. So it's an interesting time to commune with spirit, taking advantage of those thin veils. You may have a stronger or enhanced psychic capacity. It could be a time where there's a lot of guidance or a lot of channeling or remote viewing or strange dreams, things like this. So there can be a lot of interesting things. There's like all sorts of very intense tantric rituals that are intended to be take place on an eclipse. So there's ways to use that energy for our enhancement. And then there's things that don't work on an eclipse. It's like I always get clients who around eclipse time, they'll like call me the day after an eclipse and be like, I just sold my house, took a new job, and got married yesterday. Like I'm exaggerating, obviously, but not completely. And they'll say, how do you think that's going to go? And, knowing in my mind that there's another eclipse coming up in a couple of weeks, we always have the solar eclipse 2 weeks apart from a lunar eclipse. I'll like do my best to give them hope, but at the same time, it's like I know that anything that starts on an eclipse is going to be very unpredictable. It's going to have results that you didn't expect. And so I always advise people not to commence anything important in the material world or even commence like an important spiritual practice unless it's designed for the eclipse, because it will have a strange birth time. It has like everything has a birth time and a birth chart, including people and things and events. And so in order for them to have a really great start, you actually want to avoid an eclipse. And in fact, for people who are empathic out there, who are very sensitive, if you just feel the energy on the day of an eclipse, it's pretty wild. So if you imagine infusing whatever you're beginning with that energy, it may not be the ideal energy, right? Like there might be a better day to start something. So the 2 weeks in between the eclipses are always like a little bit of a twilight zone. Strange things happen. It can be like upside down land. Sometimes you'll see like couples getting back together that were firmly broken up. Suddenly for those 2 weeks, they're back together. And then at the end of the last eclipse, they're done. Jobs that come in, the dream job that surfaces on the first eclipse and evaporates on the second. The perfect looking home that turns out to be not so hot. Things like that can happen. And then that window closes after the second eclipse, but anything that's birthed during that time can be very interesting and strange.
So the advice is to lay low, not make any decisions, don't sign any contracts.
Yeah, that's my advice. I mean, if you can avoid it, sometimes these things are predestined. You can't avoid it. It's amazing to watch. I'll tell people like stay away from the eclipse, and for some reason, it's the only day that they can do this thing that absolutely has to be done that, So people can do what they can do. And if you do have to start something on an eclipse, it's not the end of the world. Just keep your eyes open.
Yeah.
Is my advice, just be surrendered to the fact that things may turn out differently than you expect them to turn out. And that's okay.
Oh, that comes down to acceptance again.
Right, exactly. We can do our best and then leave the rest up to the universe or God or whoever we relate to.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's interesting about the eclipse is that there's a lot of eclipse energy in our politics right now. Donald Trump was born on an eclipse. So this eclipse window could be very interesting politically. I'll refrain from going too deep into that topic, just to say that the United States is very, very influenced by the planets that are involved in eclipses, specifically the nodes, Rahu and Ketu, and so is our president. And so it'll be very interesting to see what unfolds in the next 2 weeks.
Well, you heard it here first. Pay attention. Tara, if people are interested in learning a little bit more about you or getting a reading, how could they get a hold of you?
Yeah, I'd be absolutely honored for anyone who wants to have a birth chart reading and really understand everything that's going on in the arena of any of the key areas of your life, relationships, romantic and otherwise, business, career, purpose, health, all that good stuff. And the best way to learn more about that and to schedule a reading is to visit my website, which is visionaryreadings.com. And you can just click on the readings tab or page, and there's lots of information there. And you can even schedule the reading.
Yeah, I've had a reading with Tara, and it was great. So if anyone's interested, I would highly recommend giving it a shot and having her read your chart. You will learn quite a few things about yourself, probably things that you didn't expect, which is always fun. Tara, I want to thank you for taking your time to talk a little bit about, astrology and your experiences and what it entails. I think there's a lot of power in your medicine, and I think that it's helpful for everyone to want to learn, or at least have access to learn a bit more about, who they are, how their chart, how their destiny is laid out to an extent, and some of the things that they might encounter in their lives. To me, knowledge is always power. And yes, I can totally go along with your premise of free will and how much we have and how much we don't have. And I think that's an interesting point by itself. So I think that's something that I'm probably going to explore myself and maybe on a future podcast. So I want to thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to having you back. And I think it's going to be, I think this is going to be the beginning of a powerful conversation and possibly experience for a lot of the audience. So thank you, Tara.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here, and I really appreciate you having me on to talk about my favorite topic.
Yes. So again, thank you. I want to thank everyone for listening, and I want to welcome everyone back to the present moment.
Thank you for listening to the Are You Being Present podcast, brought to you by the Presence Projects. Remember, you have a choice. Choose to be present.